Okay, welcome back, everyone. We'll be getting started in a moment with our panel discussion, the last segment of today's symposium. I really want to thank everyone who's been with us today and all of our speakers. So our panel discussion today is being moderated by two of our art history faculty here at Indiana University, Melody Barnett Deusner and Jeffrey Saletnik graciously agreed to do this. I want to just give a brief introduction for both of them, and then we will get started. I also wanted to ask if all of our presenters could turn on their video. And I'm going to ask all of our non-presenters if you wouldn't mind turning off your video. And that way all of our presenters and moderators will be clustered together at the top of our screen. We'll be able to see everyone clearly in that way. And again, when it's time to ask any questions during this discussion, we'll do the raise hand function as before. So going ahead with a few intros, Jeffrey Saletnik is Assistant Professor of Modern Art, Architecture and Design here at Indiana University. Among his publications are the volume Bauhaus Construct, Fashioning Identity, Discourse, and Modernism, which he co-edited with Robin Schuldenfrei, and also a co-edited special issue of the journal Art in Translation on the theme of translation and architecture. A monograph on Joseph Albers entitled Joseph Albers, Late Modernism and Pedagogic Form is forthcoming from the University of Chicago Press in September 2022. And Melody Barnett Deusner is a specialist in late 19th and early 20th century art. She is the author of Aesthetic Painting in Britain and America, Collectors, Art Worlds, Networks, and this was published in 2020. And she is now working on a project about the everyday experiences of living with pictures in the historical United States. And I'll turn it over to the two of them now. They're together in a Zoom square.
Here we go. Yeah, we decided that we would be together for this part to cut down on the squares. Thank you, Jenny, so much for organizing this event and also for organizing this wonderful exhibition. And thank you to all of the presenters who have certainly given us a lot to think about as the moderators of a panel discussion. The way we're going to approach this is we selected themes that we thought might be interesting to posit for further discussion among the speakers. And I'm going to introduce a few of those themes, and then about halfway through, we're going to switch gears and Melody will introduce a few more themes that are related to my themes, but also different. So one thing that struck me in listening to these presentations was the relationship between architecture and abstraction and commercialization. And this came up in a few of the talks and point, I think, to different concerns that might be sufficient for us to discuss as a group or expand upon. And one has to do with the status of the mural and the distinction between the pre-war and post-war practice that was made by Emily, I believe. And one of the things that struck me in that discussion of Mumford and Huxtable and the murals that were being produced in post-war architectural spaces is that these are now corporate spaces, and they are manifestations of a kind of corporate patronage. And speed, and I don't think that you mentioned this in your talk, is also important to Huxtable. If I remember that essay properly, part of why a modernist mural is appropriate for the lobby of the Corning Glass building, for instance, is that people are in a hurry to get to work and they don't have time to sit back and ponder the meaning of a composition, so that there is a consumability that seems significant to remark upon. Why that strikes me is because it's very evident that the Stuart Davis mural swing landscape does not function in that way. So I feel like that's an interesting thread perhaps for us to pull. Along with that, I was struck, and I would put a little pressure, I think, on Jody and her use of swing, because I too was curious as to why this is called swing landscape and not jazz landscape, for instance. And to me, this issue of accessibility and perhaps even commercialization is part of this, because I'm certainly no expert, even close, on the history of jazz, but my understanding of swing music is that it is or was a mechanism to make African American music, a tradition that was predominantly African American, accessible to white audiences and consumable by people who would go to Carnegie Hall to see a concert. We do have, of course, the examples of Basie and Ellington, but we also have the examples of, Glenn Miller and Tommy Dorsey, and, very, very white figures. And that strikes me somehow in terms of the use of swing, especially in light of what Harry said about, Davis's own interest in certain kinds of music, and that doesn't seem to correspond. So I thought maybe it's interesting for us to consider that somewhat, especially in light, and this is something that might set up concerns, or not concerns, but thoughts that Melody has about the sites in which these murals were positioned. And my understanding, and I could be wrong, but originally I think that the Williamsburg housing project was supposed to be segregated. It was only for white residents, and that was ultimately changed. So it doesn't seem, a stretch necessarily to think about the title of the piece as related to that, perhaps in some way. I also wonder why it's a landscape and not a seascape, but maybe that's, a separate issue, because I kept looking at all of the pictures that Harry was showing, and I was like, these are all seascapes. They're not, are they landscapes? But I digress from that. So again, like thinking about architecture, abstraction, commercialization, perhaps relating that to accessibility, perhaps relating that to reception in terms of murals more generally. Abstract murals is perhaps being too easy and not critical enough to be considered by the kind of elite art critics. I think you should be unmuted.
I guess I should just, yeah, okay, I'm now unmuted and I can talk. Yeah, I think it's really essential that one consider a mural. We talked about what a mural was, but the site where the mural is, what's the purpose of that mural? And during the New Deal, the purpose of most of the murals was tied to where the place was. So in Harlem Hospital, for example, it had to do with the history of medicine. In some of the schools, the Lucien block had to do with the history of music, and it was done for a music room. Now, James Brooks is a very interesting example. It was done about the history of flight. That was an area in which you talked about contemplation. People wait for a long time in an airport, so they have plenty of time to look at this whole thing and see how it transpires and what's happening and so on. In terms of Williamsburg, they had plenty of time. They were in community rooms. They could have looked at Stuart Davis and thought about it, But I think what people said before about Lescaz and Burgoyne Diller's accepting and saying how these murals could be accepted and seen, they had to be tame. They had to be sort of decorative, if you will.
I can jump in if you want. I think that you know, pre-war, post-war divide is very significant, and you know, both in terms of patronage, but also style, and just thinking about the Drake University mural by Davis, which I haven't seen in person, but I know it's huge. It's really architectural. It's kind of bland. The personality is sort of suppressed a little bit, and it makes Swing Landscape really look more like a big painting, you know, that he was going to place in a room. And you know, but a lot of Davis's paintings have that kind of all over sort of mural feel, but I think that you know, it does make me wonder the extent to which you know, he's still an easel painter, you know, in the WPA, really. And but at the same time, we know that there, I mean, as Clement Greenberg wrote, there is a crisis of the easel picture. I think that was a 1943 essay. So we feel that easel picture kind of spreading and breaking apart in some way. The jazz question you raised, I would push back against any too easy idea of swing as a sort of whitening of Black music, just because there's so many cross currents. And one of Charlie Parker's favorite alto players was Jimmy Dorsey, and you know, I think that it is a little surprising that Davis used that word swing for the painting, because he more often is talking about hot jazz in his writings, and there's that painting Hot Stillscape for 6 colors. So maybe there was some thought of a larger appeal, but I wouldn't put it really in simple racial terms. I would sort of you know, caution about that.
I like it better in the terms that you talked about in language and punning, that swing has that great sound to it, and the machines swing and the music swings, and you know, the society swings.
The boats in the harbor.
Yeah,
and,
it all swings.
Yeah, he did have a great sense of play with language, and yeah.
It's more mellifluous than jazz.
Mm-hmm.
I would just add that firstly, it's kind of confounding to know where to locate ourselves in trying to understand why Davis would title this with Swing Landscape. And it, in my mind, it kind of turns around this notion: was he trying to botch this commission? So, you know, if he was, that might suggest one set of things, or if he's trying to appeal to the constituency that the Williamsburg houses were intended for, or to the administrators, you know, the title is outward facing. So what audience is he trying to appeal to? And is he trying to appeal to them, or is he trying to not offend them, but, you know, make this painting that isn't fit for a purpose? So there are two issues there. And then there was no question that, of course, you know, the culture industry was very much commercializing and commodifying swing music, but it was at one and the same time, the proletarian protest music of the moment and communism and fellow travelers, almost by definition, were equal. You know, it was all about equality across genders and classes and races. So swing became this kind of again, code for integration. So it does many things. It is overdetermined. It becomes the music, you know, again, of the U.S. Army, of government sending over music for the troops during the war. But it's also the chosen music of the Communist Party for all of their fundraisers. So it's, you know, it has so many different kinds of meanings that trying to nail down what Davis wants us to take away from that is almost beautiful in its multiplicity, because that's, you know, that's what Davis loves doing, is giving us so much and many things all at once. So the signifiers are pointing in many directions.
I could jump in for a second, just to, I think, yes, absolutely. That's what's fascinating about it. It makes it so rich. And maybe it's as much a question about how we have written about it, or how we have chosen to articulate it. Because one thing that struck me in your talk, and I don't think these are not your words, but you were quoting them, about the performance at Carnegie Hall, was a coming out of jazz to the world of respectable music, which does imply that there is something that is, there is some kind of non-respectable music. So to me, that does somehow make one question, or make me consider, if there's something else kind of lurking below the surface in terms of how it was received.
I think Davis would have loved it if it cut both ways.
Yeah.
One question I have, maybe Jenny can answer this, and it goes to the issue of, did he want to fail? I assume he was getting paid as he went along, because, you show your studies and you get your paycheck, but was there a payday at the end? Do we know that he was or wasn't going to get? I assume if it had been approved, maybe he would have kept working and gotten more money. I don't know, but we know he was very poor.
Well, I don't know precisely about the payments, but yeah, I think he was being paid as he went along, according to the WPA wage system. I mean, I think it's very interesting that the mural was completed, seems to have been completed, and then not installed. Of course, at least one other mural, and possibly two, met the same fate. They were completed but not installed. One thing I want to point out about that, we've talked a little bit about the documentation being very incomplete regarding the rejection of swing landscape, or the reasons why. Now, there was, I think it was at some point in 1937, one of Davis's studies, I'm not sure which one, was in fact rejected for swing landscape. But in the same letter from, I think it was, I can't remember which of the agencies right now rejected it, but they also rejected Ilya Balatovsky's mural. And that one was, then we see it's completed and installed. So I don't know what to make of that rejection. There must have been some further discussion, and the artists were able to continue their work. But yeah, he was presumably paid for materials too, to continue the work on this large scale painting.
Thanks.
And Emily wanted to add anything, or
well, and actually maybe I will jump in, because the question I had was directed primarily at Emily anyway. So this is a kind of to branch off of this issue of thinking about who lived in the Williamsburg houses and how do we think about audience for these murals. And I know that Gail was already Greta, was already starting to talk a little bit about kind of time and thinking about spending time in various spaces with these things, but kind of expanding out from just thinking about Davis specifically, to kind of think about murals from this period in general, I was wondering if people would like to comment a little bit on ways that we might start to theorize the experience of living with these things, either seeing them in a kind of peripheral awareness that barely dawns on you that it's there, or a kind of long duration of spending time with these things, experiences that are likely not recorded, as such. I know that Emily's working on a project related to living with pictures and living with murals, so I was particularly interested in her take on this, but I thought some of our other speakers might also have something to add on this as well.
Thank you. Yeah, those are both excellent questions, and I think your comments just now really link up nicely with Jeffrey, your question at the beginning about the kind of consumability of these works and how that changes from a kind of New Deal conception into the post-war period. And you're absolutely right. And in one of those two articles by Huxtable that I was quoting, she talks about, I think her word is something like, it's like spontaneous appreciation or something like that. These murals need to be able to be read right by the people on the go, sort of passing through the lobby, walking by quickly. And I think you're right. And I'm going to sort of answer Jeffrey's first question. I think we'll also link up to your question, Melody. But I think that you're right that Davis's mural functions in a very different way than the non-objective, sort of strictly geometric murals that are installed at Williamsburg. And I don't think we need to call the Williamsburg ones tame, actually, to kind of account for the difference. I think we might describe the difference as something about their sort of mode of address, because Davis is absolutely wanting to address a viewer, or even maybe a collective set of viewers in that work. Its whole kind of organization is, the word confrontation is a little too strong, but it's very much about, the viewers who are taking it in, the picture kind of presenting itself, and then whatever kind of critical work that might be able to do. And I think that's very different from ideally what, let's call it, abstraction at architectural scale wants to do or tries to do. And that is, to fit in with the architecture, to work with an architecture that is much more subtle, and I think much closer to what you were saying, a sort of peripheral sense, a kind of subtle and often maybe sensory, spatial sense that it shapes for the viewer. The one thing that's a common throughout modern muralism in the collaborations between architects and artists is the artists always talk about this ideal of integration, and yet often get really frustrated when it starts to really reach that point of total integration, because at a certain point that the painting, the abstract surfaces, they lose their border, right, as art. They kind of fade away as something different. They lose that sense of kind of confrontation or presentation that you get in something like the Davis work. And I think that for a lot of the abstract artists making murals, both in the New Deal period and in the post-war years, that's an ongoing tension for them. It's something that discursively, rhetorically, they really want. They really want to have that work that is so, consonant with the building that it forms this total ensemble. And at the same time, they get very anxious about the sense of authorial control, or the sense of what the painting can accomplish if it becomes so much like architecture. And I think you sort of see that again and again. Interestingly, there's a way in which in the New Deal, just administratively, it really encourages one to continue to think about the mural as a sort of standalone work, even though it's on site, simply because it is set up as a series of projects administratively and bureaucratically for which you hire people to do specific works for buildings. So even though you have people like Davis and others who are going to the site and doing research, there is this sense that there is still this kind of distinction that can be maintained. The one way to think about the WPA is a sort of just distribution system. That's one of the things it does. It has artists, and then it finds buildings, and it helps put them together, or the artwork, the murals with the buildings. And I think that does preserve some sense of that boundedness, even when we're talking about these very sort of architecturally integrated works of art. I think one of the reasons that's not there, that sense of anxiety is not there for the Farley Heisen, is because she was so involved with the architecture, and because it was her personal space. So there's a way in which the collapsing of those registers is just very acceptable, right? It doesn't sort of infringe on her sense of authorship or artistic control. But I think it's a great question to sort of think about the actual phenomenology in a temporal sense too, of living with and experiencing these works. And I think they do have very different kinds of speeds, different kinds of temporalities for the way that you take them in.
I just wanted to jump in on that again, because I think I told you I called people, I made phone calls. Is there many times they had been living with it, working with it for months, years. They didn't notice it. It becomes part of their everyday, and they just don't even notice it. But let me give you a really interesting contemporary example. At Juilliard, there is a major mural by Louise Nevelson. It's called Night Light Sphere. It's the whole back wall of just outside the theater that you go down into. It's a magnificent work. Nobody knows it's there. It's not lit. It didn't have a label until fairly recently. I've written about it. I intend to write more about it. I asked my students, none of them had any idea. They think it's part of, I think it's just a decoration, and it's a problem.
I'm sure all of our screens look different, but does Helen Harrison have a question?
She does, yeah. Why don't we
Yeah,
let
do you
her-
want to, would this be a good time for Helen to ask that question? Okay,
Yes.
I'll go ahead and unmute you then. Okay.
Hi, everybody. It's great to see you all, some old friends and some folks I don't know at all, but I'm delighted to join in with this wonderful occasion to celebrate Stuart Davis, one of my very all-time favorites, despite his opinions about Pollock. We won't go there. But what I did want to say, I had a couple of interruptions, so I didn't hear the whole thing word for word, but one word that I did not hear is syncopation. When I look at swing landscape, I see a very syncopated rhythm. And I think that not only that's a hallmark of a certain type of jazz, but it's very much a hallmark of Davis's aesthetic. So maybe Greta could talk a little bit about syncopation and what that actually means. But I have one other point, and that is that unlike jazz, Davis's work is not improvised. I mean, jazz starts off with a tune or some kind of a basic line of musical notes, and then in improvisational jazz, it goes off into the stratosphere. But there's something and Harry really brought this out, and I think probably the exhibition does too, that there are many sketches, many studies, many variations on the same theme. The work is extremely carefully plotted and planned. Nothing is left to chance. Every inch of that canvas is deliberate. And unlike improvisational jazz, it is very almost polar opposite. So maybe Harry, you'd like to say something about that.
Let me just say something about syncopation. I had meant to say that. Somebody actually described jazz at one point is when you have syncopation on your syncopation. And what it is where there's not a regular rhythm, but where the rhythm, instead of going da, da, it's da, 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 which brings in a sense of interruption, which makes it swing, which makes it a little bit unexpected. I would like Harry to talk more about the jazz thing because I don't agree with you at all. And I'm curious to see what he thinks in terms of jazz and improvisation.
Sure. You don't agree with Helen, is that right?
Correct.
On the improvisation thing.
Yes.
Yeah, I think improv, I mean, my take, I guess, is syncopation is it's in all music, and you know, it may be more prominent in jazz, or as Greta was just saying, sort of extra in jazz. I guess I was more concentrating on the word swing, which I think has a, I mean, when you swing eighth notes, for example, you're playing them not evenly, but not that unevenly either. It's a very kind of subtle sort of movement that I was trying to capture with, and I think Davis maybe was capturing with this word swing. But I agree, syncopation is essential. But on the improv question, I think that there are a lot of ideas about improvisation. My son is studying jazz, and his teacher says, you know, you never play something if you don't know what you're about to play. It can be a sort of very last minute, last second kind of knowledge, but and there's also certainly in jazz, the aspect of improvising on a structure, a song form, a set of chords that give you a roadmap. And some people think you should really stick to that roadmap. Don't play a note that's not one of the chord tones, you know. So I think I do think Davis was improvising precisely because he had these structures that he could play with, and maybe he wasn't improvising the way Pollock was, you know, where, you know, as you know, where he's dancing on the canvas. But with Davis, I think it can just be a slower, somewhat more premeditated kind of dancing.
I think, as you're sort of pointing out, there are many kinds of jazz. And the kind that Helen was referring to is this more, I think, contemporary jazz, where you talked about the stratosphere, where it gets kind of atonal and goes off into things. But the more traditional jazz, which I think Davis would have known better, does definitely have a structure. It's not
Davis was, towards the end of his life, he was aware of avant-garde jazz and make some notations about Cecil Taylor. I think he probably would have felt about him the way he felt about Pollock, but he was wanting to sort of stay informed, at least.
I would just add something super briefly. This goes back to a couple of comments about audience, and so it doesn't apply to Davis in this instance, and Greta's comment about people not being aware of the murals. One of the things that was super instructive to find in the archive was that the Residents Association at Williamsburg had written to the FAP to ask for more murals because the residents liked them so much. So that was a very interesting thing to confirm, that it wasn't just that this art was being foisted upon people who either didn't look at it or didn't like it, but in fact felt that it did energize and animate and improve their quality of life to the point that they were requesting more.
Thank you for that. I didn't know that. I did know in there was a women's prison in Greenwich Village that Lucien Bloch did a painting for. And there are records, just like you were talking about, of each of the residents saying, or residents, the prisoners actually, saying how much it meant to them. So I guess it really depends on the people, the time, the place.
So Melody or Jeffrey, do you have any follow-up questions, or would you like if we open it up to anyone else?
I would think now might be a good time to open it up for other questions to the panel, or questions the panelists have for each other, either way.
Okay, so feel free.
I had a question for Emily, I think. Just looking at the Frelinghuysen murals, and I have been there and really enjoyed it, and got a very nice tour from, was it at maybe one of the children, I think. But they do come across very much as sort of individual sort of moments, and then they're maybe tied together in that dining room. Rather than an attempt to deal with the whole wall as a sort of a continuity, almost like an easel-like approach. And I think Greta said, you know, are they cutouts? Are they, you know? And I wonder if you could talk more about that with Morris and Frelinghuysen. Was there a real sense that they a real commitment to muralism, or were they painting pictures onto the wet plaster?
That's a great question. And it's a good point about Farley Heisen. There is even, especially with that central fresco that's over the fireplace, it has a little bit of lift to it. It's sort of that whole sort of, there's a little bit of texture kind of comes off the wall a little bit, which I think helps to emphasize that sense of them almost looking like shaped canvases that sit there. And you're right, they are very in a sense isolated from one another. I think for me, what ties them together has to do with the symmetry of their organization, right? You have these, well, certainly on that long wall over the fireplace, you've got these two kind of bookends of sort of layered forms of kind of cubist space, and then this central smaller mural in between them. And then over the kind of side table, as you turn the corner, that again is a sort of smaller work with brass in it that kind of rhymes with that intermediary work on the long wall. So to me, that's the kind of, there's almost a sort of sequence that moves you across that room visually. And then what I found really fascinating when I went there is that the way the wall is painted that they sit on does have this kind of textural element to it that sort of, well, certainly it's a wall, it's not a giant fresco, but it does blur sort of this question about where, it blurs the line between where those paintings end as paintings and where the rest of the kind of space begins. I do think that, you know, we can talk about this blurring together of art and life, which I think a lot of these murals are trying to do. But then you can ask, well, where does that leave us? And I think in the case of Frelinghuysen for sure, and Morris too to some degree, it's not so much about bringing art down into kind of quotidian daily life as it is about almost elevating life onto a kind of aesthetic level. And I think that's something that really separates that house from, say, the work of Davis or other artists who are thinking in a much more kind of socially critical and open way. I mean, that's a bit of a simplification. Davis is also so interesting because he is so interested in kind of popular culture and mass culture, and yet such a rigorous formalist at the same time, right? So rigorous about the abstraction that he's trying to pursue there. But I think that would sort of be my answers. I do think that there's a consideration of space that is different from just the easel paintings that they make. And I think it's one that tries to sort of, turn modernist living into its own kind of art. I do think that what's very unique about the Farley Heisen dining room, which is different than the Morris, is how cubist they are. And just thinking off the top of my head, it's hard for me to think of another mural that is really, or series of murals that is really made up of what are essentially cubist still lifes in that way. I mean, Morris is also influenced by Cubism, but the works that he does for that house are very much about, I would say, kind of dividing space in a sort of geometric way. And I do think that makes them unique and might account a little bit for that sense of how kind of distinct each one can feel. And certainly that image, that sort of night shot I showed of each one illuminated by its own spotlight would also encourage that reading of these kinds of paintings that sort of stand alone, but also I do think speak to one another. Perhaps thinking of them in a sort of sequence or a chain is a way to bring them together.
Thank you.
Just super fast. Both Farley Heisen and Morris were very close with Jean Hélion, who was also using a Cubist vocabulary and turning it into mural form.
That's right. And I think that's a lovely connection because, when you ask, well, what is public about the kind of mural that, say, Farley Heisen is pursuing or that Morris is pursuing? And it's very much along the lines that Hélion sort of lays out actually in an interview with Morris that's published, in which he talks about that abstraction having a sort of way of reading differently when it's part of architecture, that architecture is the kind of best place for that abstraction to be seen and to be experienced. And that is a kind of public. It's a consideration of the way architecture kind of organizes space and creates kind of collective viewership, but it's a very different sort of public than what someone like Davis is interested in. So I think we can kind of distinguish those from one another without disqualifying one or the other. They certainly have different political valences, absolutely. But I think that they're sort of both there in the mix of what it means to make public art in the 1930s.
Well, if I can jump in just for a second too, I mean, that's quintessentially a modern initiative in a sense that the Congress of International Congress of Modern Architecture are thinking of a relationship between visual arts and architecture that is meant to educate people about experience, about being modern in a sense through these commissions.
That's right.
Thank you. So we have a couple of hands up. I'll call on Karen first.
The fascinating thing about the Farley Heisen house, and I agree, the dining room is quite wonderful. It's how schizophrenic it is in terms of, sort of these are conceived of as individually decorated rooms. And if you go up to Susie's bedroom, or I was fortunate enough to stay in the guest house when I was working on a project, you're smiling, you know exactly what I'm going to say. The murals there are figurative, decorative, landscapey. They reminded me of things I remember from Lord and Taylor's dressing rooms when I was a child. So there are all kinds of things going on in that house that have nothing to do with public art.
And yes, that's absolutely right. And I'll just speak quickly. I think that you're right. There is a kind of sort of each space in there is very much conceived. I think there's a lot of attempts at integration, but it's very cellular. Each kind of space is its own holistic space. And you're absolutely right. And this is true, Farley Heisen, before she became an abstract painter, painted in more realist styles. But that was never really part of her kind of, public artistic persona. And I do think it's telling that a lot of that those more realist works, or realist is almost the wrong word. They're kind of sort of landscape fantasy. Yeah. Some of them almost have a kind of Trompe l'oeil sense of you're looking out onto a landscape through a kind of architectural frame. it's telling that they're upstairs in the more kind of private
Mhm.
bedrooms, et cetera. And they're not kind of at that ground floor level where they would be kind of greeting and entertaining people. And that's not to discredit them. I think they play a really important role. A lot of them are seem to be depictions of places that they traveled. I think there's a Tuscan landscape and places that they were very fond of. But I do think there's a bit of a kind of public and private a distinction that happens in those different spaces.
Well, the guest house is public.
No, that's true. And the guest house is a very different space itself. And yeah,
Yeah.
that's a very good point. And I think served as her studio too at one point, if I'm not
Yeah, it did.
Yeah.
It did.
Yeah. So that's a good point. That there is that. And I do think that almost what a sort of common denominator across that campus, that space there, is a sort of sense of the charm that art can bring to a
Mhm.
space, and that might be in a very in a sort of more whimsical and realist sense, or it might be in the kind of abstract or cubist sense.
Okay, I'm going to call on Stephen, who has a question.
Hi, thank you all very much for this talk. It's all of the papers today have been so wonderful. I've really learned a lot from them. My question is really for everyone, just to ask how you see the legacy of this period. You know, I in particular am coming at this from an interest in abstract expressionism, and so I'm interested in how the people who worked on the Williamsburg project were affected by it, you know, like de Kooning and Lee Krasner, and yeah, just sort of how you're thinking about the influence that these works had on subsequent generations.
I'd like to say something about that. The mural that Jackson Pollock painted for Peggy Guggenheim came directly out of that idea. He was frustrated that he couldn't paint murals on the mural division, and he saw all of these large paintings, at least that's the literature I've read, and wanted to try his hand at that. And as you saw, James Brooks he uses this as a way to get there. And the largeness, the bigness, well, of course, the ironic paradox in abstract expressionism that they want to reach everybody on an elemental level and don't in other ways. But it comes out of that duality, I think, of largeness and accessibility and so on. And of course, these were the first abstract paintings to be seen widely.
I'll just make a brief comment. And like swing has these many meanings, and a mural can be so many different things. The relations between art and democracy, and that was an upshot of the New Deal, bringing artists onto, you know, the roles like any other laborer, believing that their skills should be protected and that they contributed something that was meaningful, even in the midst of, you know, a terrible economic crisis. And then also, you know, democracy, freedom of expression. And certainly they had something to act against in terms of what was going on under fascism and ultimately under the prescriptions of Stalinism. But I think that episode, and I'm not talking about particular formal vocabularies or even just the size and scale and mode of address of murals in particular, but a belief that the production and reception of art, almost going back to Dewey, you know, art as experience, that this is a cornerstone of a democratic society and should be protected.
I'll also just give an answer. It's a really good question. And I think one of the things that's so interesting to me about the Farley Heisen Morris house is that it gives us this example of an abstract mural for a domestic space that's from, well, I guess it's from the sort of wartime, but it comes out of this sort of pre-war geometric abstraction milieu. And I like that because that, you know, the New Deal gives us this idea that murals are sort of only in public spaces, but there is a long history of murals for music rooms, for artist houses, that very much turns on the connection between sort of decoration and sort of sensory qualities and leisure, right? The leisure that you can take in a domestic or a private setting. And I think that's really useful because it allows us to then look at what a certain kind of geometric abstraction does with that and compare it to someone like Pollock, who partly with the Guggenheim mural in 1943, but even more so with the second mural that he did for the Marcel Breuer house, is also making a large scale abstraction to be inserted into a highly modernist house. And that one's in 1950, so we're at a slightly later point. But I just think it's helpful to kind of have these two different examples. You know, what does it look like to put a certain kind of abstraction into a certain kind of modernist space in 1941? And then how have those terms changed by 1950 in terms of what the domestic space means as a kind of retreat, in terms of the way space functions, say in the Breuer house, which is in a much more fluid and dynamic way than in the sort of more geometric Farley Heisen Morris house. But it's an interesting kind of comparison point. You know, the Farley Heisen Morris house gives us this very clear example of artists coming out of that New Deal moment who were doing something very concretely domestic and private, and a sense of what it looks like.
I'd just like to say one, I hope, sort of concluding comment. I gave this a trial run with my students the other day, and I've gotten some responses from them, and most of them are so shocked that they did not know about this, that they knew nothing about this. And the idea of bringing this forward and publicizing it and teaching it opens up so many doors and so many possibilities. And I think young students just love it. So I think it's really important to continue and for everybody to continue their research in this field.
Thank you so much, Greta. I think that is a great way to conclude today. I do see Karen's hand up, but I'm assuming that's from before. So I hope I'm making the right assumption, but we are kind of at the end of the allotted schedule for the day. So I just want to again thank all of the presenters today for your really compelling talks, which sparked some great discussion, and for all of your reflections. And thank you to Melody and Jeffrey for your moderating during the panel discussion. One more thank you as well to IU's College Art and Humanities Institute for helping to fund today's program. And for any of you who are in Bloomington or might be able to make it out here before May 22nd, I do hope that you will be able to stop by the museum, see the exhibition in person. It is not traveling anywhere, partly due to the condition of swing landscape, but that's another whole different topic. Again, thanks to all of our everyone who participated and attended today. Recordings will be available, I think, within a couple of weeks, and those will be sent out to you in case you missed part of today's program. So I think with that, we will say goodbye and good evening.